online. It's a great privilege for us to host you today as the New Development Bank, together with the Development Bank of Southern Africa, co-hosting this conversation on the just transition. Our panelists are seated here to my left is Joanne, the Chief Operations Officer of the Industrial Development Corporation, Vikram, who's a climate finance expert and senior advisor to CPI, Catherine Kaufman, who's the Group Executive for DBSA, and then Dr. Chippy Olva, who heads up the Presidential Climate Commission. I'd like to kick off with you, Chippy, if you could start out and maybe just want to make one or two sort of opening statements. I think that over time there's been a recognition that South Africa has played a very critical role over the last probably eight years or so, actually, not just since Paris, to give prominence to the just transition. The investment plan has now taken us to the next level. I mean, later on, I'd like for you to talk about what the next phase involves. But I want you to just start off by giving me sort of a flavor of how you address this question. And because in my conversations with global audiences and investors, I find that the macro story about South Africa, the energy insecurity issues, the lack of significant increases in foreign direct investment often overshadows the important work that we have done and the consensus that we have built around the just energy transition. And I wanted to know how you sort of address that when you confront investors.
Hello. Morning, everyone. Nice.
I think your mic is not on. So if you press it one more time, oh, it's on. Okay, yeah. It's on. It's okay.
It's off.
It's on.
Now it's on. Morning, everyone. Thank you for getting up so early on a Saturday. It's great to see you all here, and thank you, Leslie, for hosting us. So look, on the South African transition is probably one of the, I think I can move it actually, so it allows me to look at you. It's one of the toughest to navigate because we have an enormously emissions-intensive economy. Probably the highest emissions intensity in terms of the products we produce of any country in the world. And just by way of comparison, our emissions intensity is double that of China's. That's the emissions embedded in every product that we export from the country. It's 70% higher than that of India's. And the big shift that's happened recently is an understanding of the economic risks we face as a country if we don't transition. So, you know, there are risks if we transition too fast, because we're going to obliterate large sections of coal and fossil fuel petrochemical value chains. But if we do not transition rapidly enough, we're equally going to become uncompetitive. A lot of our trade sectors are going to be shut out. So, you know, sorry, this is cutting. We mapped a trajectory that gets us to net zero by 2050. That's based on detailed consultation that's taken place with various economic sectors. Very importantly for the business, thank you. Very importantly, the business sector in South Africa, led by the National Business Initiative, did a detailed modeling exercise on pathways to net zero. So we were able to quite rapidly find common ground between the main stakeholder groups in South Africa about the emissions trajectory that we need to follow. We're all agreed that, you know, there's upside in this transition. So we're going to see massive expansion, for instance, around minerals for the green economy, around renewable and battery and green hydrogen value chains, around the shift to electric vehicles. There are also downsides. So the idea of the just transition is ensuring that there's an equitable distribution of risks, that we manage the downside. So we, retrain, reskill those workers, put job placement schemes in place, have industrial policy interventions that boost the new economic sectors. And we actively support workers and communities to transition from the one economy into the next economy. That's the basic idea behind the just transition.
If you could just maybe say one or two words about the actual question I wanted to pose to you, which is to investors, how do you position the energy transition story and the green transformation as one of the new growth drivers for South Africa? Because your economy is not growing, there's energy insecurity, and at the same time, we're trying to find the new growth levers. Have we succeeded in that narrative?
Well, we're on the cusp of a major acceleration in our renewable deployment. So, you've correctly pointed out the short-term energy supply problems that we're facing with rolling blackouts. I mean, basically this old coal-fired fleet is largely beyond its economic life. It's breaking down too frequently. They're uneconomic to run and maintain that fleet of coal-fired power stations. So it pays us, quite frankly, as an economy, to ramp up renewables and pull this coal off the grid. And this transition is going to, have a double benefit. So not only is the green economy going to expand massively as we move forward, but it's equally going to address our energy security and energy access issues, because we're not just replicating the same old centralized ESCOM, utility. You're seeing a much more decentralized and diverse energy system emerge. A lot of it which is going to put assets in the hands of poor people. So, distributed solar systems, small grid deployment. A lot of this is going to fundamentally transform the energy landscape.
Thank you very much, Chippy. Let me go now to you, Joanne. The Industrial Development Corporation is a partner of ours at the New Development Bank. You are very active in facilitating increased investment in the renewable energy space. Talk to us a little bit more about how the IDC sees its role and the role of the DFIs in the just energy transition process.
Thanks, Leslie. So from an IDC perspective, we are mandated as an industrial development bank. So critical to us is looking at how we can ensure that we create sustainable industries. One of the biggest challenges of the last 10 years of energy insecurity has been the enormous impact on our manufacturing sector. And we've seen a significant loss of jobs within that sector as a result of the load shedding. So for us, the opportunity of the climate agenda and the just transition is that we are not going to create an energy crisis by transitioning. We're in an energy crisis. And responding to the energy crisis is going to give us the opportunity to reindustrialize. From an IDC perspective, we were actively involved in the initial REAP programs in de-risking the REAP approach, which has made it very commercial. As we know, we need to ramp up significantly. We're looking at something like 50 gigawatts for energy, 50 gigawatts for green hydrogen. So there's an enormous scaling that needs to take place. But within the REAP program, that's only one piece. We need to ensure, this is where we play a much stronger role, is on the commercial and industrial side. And not just commercial and industrial for large users who have the balance sheet capacity to actually be able to borrow, but ensuring that the smaller manufacturers on a collective basis are given access to renewable energy. And it's very difficult to think about renewable energy without thinking about water. So, we need to develop a programmatic approach to water because the climate impact on water is significantly inhibiting growth in the country as well. So we believe that renewable energy and water are critical enablers to economic activity. We are very focused on new energy vehicles. There obviously have been the announcements made by both Europe and the US, or the Europe and the UK, on which are major export markets of ours in the automotive space, of the the ban on ICE vehicles after 2030, 2035. And that has an enormous impact on employment in the country. So for us, a just transition also means ensuring that we protect the automotive sector and the 500,000 people employed in that sector, while facilitating the decarbonisation of transport. You know, in South Africa, we're sitting on South Africa and the region, because it's also very difficult to talk about these things in isolated countries. From a regional perspective, we're sitting on the critical battery minerals that are necessary to support not only our transition, but the global transition. So we need to look at how, with our partners in the region, we actually create industrial and economic opportunities from that, because that is what's going to ensure the justice and that there are jobs for all. On the green hydrogen side, you know, we talk about it as a nascent industry. It's a wonderful new opportunity, new export market. But for South Africa, it's also critical to ensure that companies like AMSA and Sasol are able to transition and continue to support the employees that they have. You know, IDC played a very strong role. We were there at the birth of both Sasol and Escor in the 1940s and 1950s. They continue to be very significant portions of our balance sheet, very important assets on our balance sheet, for which we criticized for the high carbon content of our balance sheet. But our job is not to walk away from them, but to ensure that we transition them. Because once we have green assets that have been transitioned through our investment and our activity in the green hydrogen, we can ensure that those assets will not only be green assets on our books, but also sustainable enterprises in the economy.
Thank you very much for that, Joanne. Now, I'd like to turn to you, Catherine. I mean, DBSA is also a very strong strategic partner of the New Development Bank in the rollout of renewable energy, but maybe you can give us a little bit more color about the distinctive role that the DBSA is playing in the just energy transition process in South Africa.
Thank you. Yes, so first of all, we partner with the IDC quite a bit, especially because they've got specialized expertise in the industrial space. But on the whole, what our role has been very much an integrated approach to infrastructure delivery. So from planning, preparation, finance, and we also, to a large degree, assist SOEs, state-owned entities in implementing their construction, build, and operating activities. What I think we are probably realizing is that in this journey of transition and finance, the upstream work that we're doing is going to become even more important, because we have to develop those pipelines that become investable for the rest of the market and that we can catalyze funding for. So the DBSA, our development mandate, unlike the IDC, is very much focused on infrastructure, because we've got a backlog of infrastructure in South Africa and the rest of the continent. And as a consequence, we have decided some time ago, so we didn't coin it transition finance, but we decided some time ago to mainstream climate finance into our development strategy through infrastructure deployment. And it's been quite an interesting journey. We realized early on we needed partners. We needed partners because I think the IDC is also not capitalized by our shareholder. So we needed partners to help us fund these large-scale projects. We also needed partners because we wanted to manage our cost of capital, which become quite tricky because we borrow from the same people that we co-lend with into projects. So as a consequence, we are accredited agent of the GCF, the GEF, and we also manage South African Green Fund. And that allows us to deploy concessional funding, patient capital, long tenors, lower interest rates into projects, especially the transition space. But more importantly, it's an open platform, so any bank, private sector party can access that. And we are actually working on projects in the very early stages with the IDC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Vikram, I wonder if I could now move on to you. You know, you spent last part of your career with the IFC. We've done, you know, extensive work in this whole upstream space. But what I would specifically want to ask you about is this de-risking that Joanne and Catherine made reference to. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is some of the innovation that you see in that space? What more can MDBs do in your view to de-risk and create a better environment for the mobilization of private capital into climate?
Yeah, great, thank you, and thank you for having me here. I'm now with the Climate Policy Initiative, which is a non-profit that actually works with governments and businesses to foster economic growth while addressing climate change. So these are issues that we are not fund managers, we are not asset managers, but there's a pool of us like me from IFC and other places that bring this to bear in a way. So we feel that just transition essentially offers a framework, an opportunity, if you like, to have public finance and mission-driven sort of financiers, the philanthropies, work with private sector investors in a way that helps them all achieve the goals more effectively. And the DFIs sit right in the middle of that space, right? So there's a huge amount of opportunity and need to innovate in terms of, I think you and I were talking just before the session, yes, blended finance, we all know about blended finance, we all sort of talk about blended finance, but I think we need to start thinking of blended finance a bit differently as well. Since you asked, let me give you perhaps one or two examples. So the cost of capital, delivered cost of capital, I think both of them said it, is a huge issue. We contributed to the Songway-Stern report that just came out earlier this week, and it's clear that if you look at that cascade of both macroeconomic and sector-specific risks, the cost of capital or the expected return on equity is so high, and I might be generalizing beyond South Africa, if you'll permit me, that it's challenging. Investors are like, oh, there is trillions of dollars waiting on the sideline, but there are no bankable projects. Well, it depends on how you define bankable, right? They're all credible projects that can be done, but they are not bankable because they're probably not meeting that risk-return profile that is expected. If you're going to take risk, you want to be paid for it. So I think focusing, and I think MDBs and DFIs, I think, have a big role there. How do you help reduce the cost of capital, right? And if you just parse it into two or three different ways, one, of course, is, I'll park sovereign risk and the whole political risk separate from that. But one huge issue is FX risk. I had the opportunity to moderate a few IDFC, a few National Development Bank CEOs earlier this week, and one of them was DBSA's CEO, and the GCF was on it. And he said, which is actually new and welcome, he said, look, I asked a question. If all of you could get 100 million untied from GCF, how do you use it? And I thought the GCF gentleman opted in and said, actually, we want to look at large-scale instruments for long-term FX hedging. And we all know TCX exists, markets exist, but I think we need to be looking at wholesale instruments that do that. How do we look at wholesale instruments that can support support credit, provide credit support, right? Do we have to go the traditional route of guarantees, or like one of the things we're proposing to the International Solar Alliance is a potentially partially capitalized guarantee pool that provides some level of credit support to both international and domestic investors, but relies primarily on donor capital backed by sovereign countries. And there is a lot of interest in starting to do that, right? I mean, the World Bank thrives on that, we know that. Developed countries are very concerned about trying to not have more put on their balance sheets. So those, and say in the context of, and I'll end with perhaps with one example in the South African context, that we all heard Senator Kerry, Secretary Kerry announce this whole thing about carbon markets and coal phase out. And I think it's a good idea, particularly if a lot of the proceeds could be used for just transition. That's going to be a big bill. The opportunities are there, but I think the whole bill, the fiscal impact, and beyond workers, supporting the workers and communities is going to be huge. So perhaps in the South African case, it doesn't need to be exported. I think South Africa is unique in the sense that it has a developed sort of industrial base, a developed capital market, and could that be internal? Could, you talked about energy intensity of South Africa being huge, and if you're going to hit this trade barrier with Europe, if they put this cross-border adjustment mechanism in place, but is it possible for South Africa to perhaps create a in-house, in-country carbon market that allows the carbon credits to stay within the country, but the Sasols and the others, polluters of the world, start to use them? And if they're credible to world level, you can argue that that transition pathway is being greened while you're waiting for the full shift to happen. And I'm sure, done right, Europe would buy that. So just a whole different sort of segments that innovation is both needed and possible, I think.
Thank you very much for that, Bikram. I wonder if I could now move on to Daniel. Daniel Scroth is the Director responsible for renewable energy and energy efficiency at the Africa Development Bank. Maybe you can give us a flavor through the AFDB lens, how you approach this question in terms of financing of energy transition throughout the African continent.
Right. No, well, first of all, pleasure being part of this panel. And indeed, I mean, the energy transition question is very important for Africa, but we also need to recognize that obviously energy transition, and particularly just energy transition, differs from one country to another. So clearly in the South African context, you can talk about a real transition from a largely coal-based power generation economy to one that is more based on renewables. So that's a transition. But if I look at countries such as Chad with a very limited generation capacity with energy access rates below 10%, it's not so much a transition rather than sort of building sustainable energy systems in the first place. So I think really we sort of need to delineate what just energy transition means, what it means in a specific context. It needs to recognize the general overall African context, which we all know Africa contributed very little to climate change, is disproportionately affected by it. And hence there also needs to be that international support through climate finance and other means to help African countries on that journey. I think it's also very critical to focus on the people-centered approach. The just energy transition, I think the previous speaker referred to it, clearly needs to involve and take along the communities that depend on fossil fuel, coal-based and other value chains at the moment. And that involves, of course, offering alternative opportunities. It involves sort of reskilling. I think here in South Africa, some 76% of people employed in the coal value chain are just in one province in Pavilion. And clearly this has to be a key focus. How can we sort of take these people along? Because ultimately an energy transition can only work if there's a broad-based consensus at the national level around sort of the way forward. And if you leave a key part of the population outside of that, obviously it will not work. I think the other part, obviously, of just energy transition is the aspect of transition. So it's obvious that that involves a certain time period. It will not be possible to transition from one day to the next. And you need to sort of define what that transition looks like, over what time frame. That needs to be linked to the broader climate change plans. I think the long-term strategies under the Paris Agreement in particular. We know that many African countries don't have these plans in place yet. It's very important that there's support being provided to have the broader strategies. And of course, just energy transition is a key component sort of the broader climate change plan. So from the bank, we're supporting South Africa and Africa on many of these fronts, on the upstream work, both in terms of planning, but also in terms of the technical assistance, the project preparation support that was mentioned is so critical, but then of course also on the financing side. And there clearly, for many projects, there's still a need for concessional financing to be provided. I think in South Africa, that's clearly not the case for the plain vanilla sort of solar wind projects. There, the private sector is already heavily invested. The commercial banks are investing in there. I don't see really their critical role for DFIs. But sort of for more innovative approaches, new kind of technologies, sort of first projects, let's say on green hydrogen, for example, there clearly is a role for the DFIs sort of to help de-risk these type of projects.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Chippy, I wonder if I could just revert back to you now. I mean, you outlined that the just transition process has multiple components to it. It's aggressive phasing out of coal, building renewables, new energy sources, and then very importantly, at the same time, we need to train, retrain workers, ensure that the losers in the process are not the communities affected, and so on. Talk to us a little bit about the creation of, like, take Mpumalanga, creation of new industries, stimulating jobs, because some of these industries are not very jobs intensive. Building large solar parks, for example, do not employ a lot of people. Talk us a little bit about that component of the community involvement in those initiatives.
Yeah, so there are a couple of, in aggregate, this transition is going to be net jobs positive. All of the modeling that we've done has shown that. But there are a couple of problems. The one is geography. So not all the jobs are going to be created in the same places that they exist today. And, particularly if you look at mining as a sector, the green minerals that we're going to need in abundance for the future. I mean, mining's going to do well out of this transition. But a lot of that, the PGMs, the iron and steel, which we'll still need, the copper up in Phalaborwa, the vanadium, the nickel, all of this is in other parts of the country, the north and western parts of the country. So there's a geography problem, and secondly, there's a timing problem. So it's going to take a while to get the demand up in, for instance, the renewable sector, for us to localize the manufacturing chains. And because we've had a slightly rocky start to our renewables procurement program, there's been a sort of on-off again policy dithering, which hasn't inspired confidence. So a lot of the people that want to invest in the value chains that support this are wanting to see the demand. They want a lot more confidence in the demand. So, these are practical issues that we have to grapple with in Mpumalanga. The vision for the province, it's been the energy hub for South Africa for decades. And we're seeing it as a future green energy hub. And it's got a couple of big resources at its disposal. First of all, you've got a huge electricity grid in Mpumalanga. At the moment, the grid capacity in the rest of the country doesn't allow much more renewables to be brought onto it. But Mpumalanga is the one province where you can do renewables at scale now. And the wind and solar resource there is not bad. It's not as good as some parts of the country, but you've got pretty good wind and solar, enough to do commercially viable projects there. The other resource, which the environmentalists don't like me to mention, is that we do have this existing gas pipeline linking to Mozambique. So there is the real possibility to do some substantial repurposing of coal-fired power plants with a combination of wind and solar and some gas peaking plants. So there's some big upsides for Mpumalanga that I think allow us to do immediate economic diversification work there.
Thanks very much, Chippy. Joanne, you touched on the fact that IDC played a critical role in the initial industrialization process in South Africa with the creation of giants like Sasol, also one of the biggest emitters in South Africa. I know that there are, for example, initiatives to create a green hydrogen industry. How is the IDC thinking through, again, its role as an incubator of these new industries, and we can make green hydrogen as an example?
So South Africa's, or IDC, should I start with, has been looking at green hydrogen for probably the last 2 years very actively. Prior to that, we had some early stage fuel cell projects that we were involved in. So IDC does have a project development area, and in 2020, we decided to re-energize project development, recognizing that the country needs not just transactions to be supported, but IDC to play the role that it played in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s to ensure that we de-risk and incubate some of these early stage opportunities. And that has increased our focus on green hydrogen projects and projects across the green value chain since 2020, where there's been this very concerted effort. In 2021, the Minister Patel established the Green Hydrogen Panel, and IDC is both the Secretariat and the acting chair, so I'm the acting chair of the Green Hydrogen Panel. And that has allowed the country to create our collective narrative on the green hydrogen opportunity. So we've got companies like Anglo American, Sasol, Novartis, Toyota, and many others. Always worry mentioning names because I know that there's critical ones that I'm omitting. But what we found is an enormous desire to collaborate, because there's a very strong recognition that the world is moving very fast in the green hydrogen space, and South Africa and Namibia are incredibly well placed to be significant global players in green hydrogen, but we need to act as a collective and we need to act quickly. So through the Green Hydrogen Panel, we've identified about 17 active projects across green hydrogen, green ammonia, mobility, decarbonisation locally, also green hydrogen for export. And we have partnership agreements with AMSA, with Sasol, with Aqua, who has done amazing things both in the concentrated solar in the Northern Cape, as well as in green hydrogen in Saudi. And we're looking at how these partnerships can allow us to unlock projects on scale in the short term. A number of the projects, as you would know, don't make commercial sense initially, so we're looking at tapping into some of the green hydrogen offtakes globally, the contract for difference, in order to ensure that we support both global decarbonisation of partner countries while ensuring that we create a commercial green hydrogen industry in South Africa. First green hydrogen has been produced, a pilot plant. It was launched by Rheinmetall, I think, 2 months ago. And we're expecting, through some of our partner opportunities, to have green hydrogen and or green steel within the next 12 to 18 months. So, very much committed to that early stage involvement, global partnership conversations, policy engagement to ensure that we do unlock the opportunity. The Green Hydrogen Commercialisation Plan has been approved by the DGs for submission to Cabinet and is currently going through the Cabinet process. And the details of the next 5 years are captured in the Country Investment Plan. So we've identified the 5-year initiatives that require short-term funding. Some of the 8.5 billion will go towards that. And we do have a partnership with KfW for unlocking some of those early-stage green hydrogen opportunities.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Vikram, can I return to you quickly and just ask you, what do you see as the single biggest obstacle for development finance institutions to play a bigger role and to scale? We spoke about de-risking. Blended finance has grown kind of incrementally over the last 5-6 years, but it has not reached the scale required. What do you see as the single biggest barrier in scaling that de-risking role that we have to play as development finance institutions?
Great. If I can, since I have the mic, if I can take a side comment and say I'm thrilled that you mentioned the fuel cell project, because if you're in this business long enough, it all comes back to you. That probably was with Plug Power, if I remember right, which we did from IFC, using GF money, based on a strategy we developed in the early 2001, so 20 years ago. We used to dream about this thing called green hydrogen. What if solar became cheap enough to electrolyze water? But here we are. And I think there is sort of a lesson there as well, that innovation continues to play a huge role. And as we talked about earlier, both in terms of introducing new technologies and having donors support that, but also in terms of de-risking. To me, I think DFIs have a significant opportunity to mobilize capital. I think they have a huge opportunity, and we can talk about that separately in terms of how to intermediate with the donors in particular. But in the context of the actual equity side of just transition. But in terms of one of the things that a few of us have been talking about and saying is that DFIs tend to originate to hold. But they are the engines. They have the ability to source deals. They have the ability, a track record to de-risk of performance. And there is a lot of confidence for all the criticisms. I think the DFIs come in, everybody wants them to do more. And one of the things I think with which they can help mobilize is also to look at how, whether it's their mandates, whether it's, let's not mess with charters, but, or some way of supporting them to what I would call originate to distribute. Take on larger chunks than you normally would, help de-risk them, and then there will be enough pool of these bankable projects that I was talking about earlier to be able to mobilize private capital. And I think that shift, along with any other reform that MDBs go through in order to use more capital, is huge. Now, of course, MDBs are going to need even more resources in terms of de-risking. And this comes back, and I won't repeat myself, this comes back to using the available and limited amount of donor money, whether through the Green Climate Fund or directly, in a much more smarter way, in a much, this whole project by project approach has to shift. And I think we need to go to wholesale. And if you combine that with the ability to originate and then ultimately mobilize, sell down and mobilize, that it could be a huge role for DFIs, I think.
Catherine, I wonder if you could maybe pick up on that theme and maybe give us a flavor of what do you see as the single biggest challenge for the DBSA to scale what you're already doing? I mean, other than sort of cost of capital, where you're kind of constrained by, the rating of the country. What is that one big sort of lever that could enable you to go to higher levels of scale in terms of the approaches you've already outlined?
Yeah, so if there's one thing I've learned, Leslie, is that just like this journey for everybody, it's multidimensional. So depending on the context, you have a different challenge for that particular driver. So you said if it's not cost of capital, what else it could be? I think in terms of, and before I finish there, I want to just challenge Vikram on the catalyzation he referred to, that we don't catalyze enough. I think that we are constrained, so we are trying to catalyze more, and that's why we're looking at most projects in a programmatic way, whether it's us or the IDC. We're trying to look at more programmatic structures, which means we get more bang for our buck. And we start by piloting a particular idea or project, and then scaling it, standardizing it. That's what we did with the IPPO office. Egypt, the Embedded Generation Investment Program, which is also a non-sovereign backed renewable energy program, and the National Water Program, which is a substantial program on its own with different subsects into it, which you'll be pleased to know, none of us can do it on our own. We can't keep that asset. We have to catalyze, we have to recycle that money. So we're acutely aware of what you're saying. And we know we always get this criticism, and I have to reiterate, it's impossible for us to carry it on our own. We try to recycle it all the time. In terms of what the other challenges are for us, I think it's going to be making sure we're all well capacitated for what we have to do. Because these skills are, to a large degree, new. We might have people who have been environmental specialists for a long time, or in this type of space for a long time, but in terms of how fast it's developing and how dynamic it is, we have to be able to capacitate all our organizations and the private sector and those people who are going to lose jobs as a consequence of us transitioning, and help them have new skills. So capacitating, getting new skills in order to grow the economy, I think that is going to be one of the biggest challenges. And last but not least, it's no point in us ramping up on renewables and we're not taking care of the distribution network and transmission. I think if if DFIs really want to make a difference, they should let go of renewables a little bit more and start focusing on that secondary market, because we need actually a network for this renewables to be deployed from. So we need to go further down the value chain, concentrate on the other industries in the energy value chain, transport, logistics. I think you play a big role. And assist those industries and those clients in the infrastructure value chain also to transition.
And can I push you a little bit more and ask you, what about sort of maybe off-the-wall ideas about increasing your own lending capacity? Could you get in fresh shareholder capital? Could you change your articles and have private institutions become shareholders, and in that way, scale your lending activity? Kind of anything out of the box that is possible in the DBSA context?
I don't know. It sounds like you're speaking to some of our folks, Leslie. I think we are always thinking about how we manage our financial capital and where we access sources of capital. And there are many ideas on the table, but maybe not for discussion today.
To come in quickly on one of the themes that Catherine touched on.
Very quickly, and I think she's absolutely right. I should have said MDBs, because I think if you expand it to DFIs, then it includes all the national development banks and the in-country banks, and I think they become an important partner and conduit for the global or regional DFIs or MDBs to work. So I absolutely agree with you on that. So thank you.
It's also good to have disagreements on panels. I like that. But let me come to you now, Daniel, and I want to ask you, you've referenced earlier on that the energy, when you look at Africa, Africa's energy is probably the #1 challenge by a long shot when you look at the development agenda. At the same time, as you know, Africa only contributes something like 3.8%. Less than 4% of global emissions come from the continent. So we've got this dichotomy. At one level, we need to stimulate, because more than 600 million people do not have access to sustainable electricity on the continent. How does AFDB look at that conundrum? We need to stimulate the growth of our economies, power wherever it comes from, whether it's gas, whether it's dirty sources, to propel our economies forward. And at the same time, we've got the climate agenda, which is not the top of the agenda because our emissions footprint is so low. How do you marry those and look at that through AFDB lens?
Right, I'm happy to come to that, but I just wanted to interject briefly on the previous question, because indeed that's a key issue, how we can increase our lending capacity as MDBs. I think from the African Development Bank side, we have been quite at the forefront of innovative balance sheet optimization measures. We recently concluded with the United Kingdom a guarantee program where basically we've been able to offload a significant part of our sovereign portfolio to private sector kind of stakeholders, freeing up additional capital that we can invest in sustainable projects. Similarly, in the context of South Africa's just energy transition, we're having ongoing conversations with the United Kingdom. As you know, as part of the $8.5 billion package, there's a $1 billion guarantee from the UK envisaged. So we're discussing with them whether that could potentially be utilized to increase sort of our headroom capacity to lend to South Africa on the just energy transition process. So I just wanted to add that element. And maybe if you allow me just one other point, because I really just think it's so critical, and it links a bit to the question that you just asked, which is on transmission. I think really that's where the MDBs, the DFIs have a key role to play. That's a fundamental bottleneck. To put it simply, there is no transition without transmission. And that also involves really focusing on some of the critical interconnections between countries, sort of to be able to share sort of relative resource endowments over borders, particularly for smaller scale countries. So if I look at, let's say, the Sahel, tremendous solar potential, yet obviously very limited energy access, poor interconnections, etc. How can we increase that capacity? That requires increasing interconnections with the power pools. Similarly in the South African context, and I think for me this is an aspect that is not getting maybe sufficient attention. It came a bit across on the natural gas side here, is how can neighboring countries also contribute to South Africa's just energy transition process. If I think about Mpanda Nkua project in Mozambique, 2,700 megawatts of hydropower, that could play a key role as well in terms of assisting South Africa's energy transition through the Southern African power pool. Obviously there's Inga, but that's a whole separate conversation in DRC. So yes, I think from our side we recognize that there is this kind of conflict. I think there is a possibility to basically focus on providing energy access using all the new technologies that are available, and I think there's a key focus on our side also on the whole decentralized energy access agenda, which is definitely critical. I think if you look at data from the International Energy Agency suggests that more than 50% of energy access in Africa will have to come in the form of either mini-grids or solar home systems. So that's one part of the equation. But the other part that is also critically important for us is the industrialization agenda. And that requires, of course, large-scale generation capacity, that requires reliable power. And this is where, in the mix, we do see in the transition and in line with kind of the Paris Agreement and national NDCs, that there is also a role for natural gas in the African context.
Thanks very much, Chippy. I wonder if I could now probe a little bit more deeper with you about what's next. You know, South Africa played a great role, as I said, in promoting the concept of a just transition. We then developed a just transition plan, an investment plan that have been announced. Its implementation. So talk a little bit now about the next steps. What does this implementation phase involve?
Yeah. All eyes are on implementation. Now that the investment plan is completed. And, you know, I don't need to tell you, South Africa's come through quite a difficult period of state capture in which a rapacious criminal elite had latched onto the state and various arms of the state, including Eskom, and hollowed out a lot of the procurement systems, etc. What our president has been leading is a comprehensive cleanup across these. There are various prosecutions underway, and we've closed the door on that state capture period very definitively, not without contest and pushback in the governing party, but the battle is largely won. So that's a very important part of the capacity for implementation challenge. The big move now is taking the grid, the transmission grid out of Eskom and setting it up as an independent operator. And
what's the sort of time frames involved with that? You know, for a long time, the separation of generation, transmission, and distribution have been on the agenda.
Yeah.
What are the time frames involved with that process of separating the transmission grid?
So the company's already set up. It's a separate company inside the Eskom stable. It's already being nurtured. The key question is not so much when is the company established. There's already an interim board in place. They're going through the motions of a new board. The critical thing is to ensure that it's got the balance sheet in order to properly raise capital to fund this grid upgrading. On the positive side, a big chunk of the 8.5 billion is going into the transmission company and grid. That includes about 12,000 kilometers of transmission lines, including transformers. I mean, we've already spoken about the challenge. The grid is configured for the coal resource, and we need to reconfigure the grid for where the renewable resource sits in the country. That is well underway. I mean, 2023, the new board will be in place. The company will be a separate operator. The legislation that's currently on its way to Parliament will have been passed. So that's going to happen. The second thing linked to that is reconfiguring the process of procuring power onto the grid. And you've already seen two very significant reforms. So the one is that we've lifted completely any restrictions on embedded generation by private operators. So private companies can now build power plants of any size, any scale, anywhere, and they can also wheel it through the grid. So they can build their power stations in one place and use it in another. And a number of them, like Anglo-American, for instance, are already building a virtual power grid linking into the transmission system in South Africa. So that's been a huge accelerator around the pace of renewable investment in the country. Eskom has now more recently taken a lot of the land that they've gotten in Mpumalanga and put it out on tender for people to do renewable and other power projects on, and they're purchasing power directly from that. So you're starting to see an opening up of the different procurement mechanisms to get power onto the grid.
Thanks very much, Chippy. Naturally, the processes you've outlined now also have some huge complexities in it and trade-offs. For example, as you say, you've now got unfettered access to a degree of private sector being able to roll out new energy. At the same time, that would lead to Eskom's financial capacity being a bit depleted because some good customers will go off grid. And the other complexity, I guess, is the fact that creating these three different balance sheets will require some sensitive negotiations with bond investors, because there are covenants in the bondholders of Eskom which will preclude just unilateral restructuring. So there could be further delays as a result of those complex negotiations that needs to take place. Joanne, I wonder if I could just come back to you for the last round and just talk to me a little bit more about the Africa-wide approach. Naturally, we zoned in on South Africa and the just energy transition, but both DBSA, yourselves, and AFDB work across the continent. Talk to us a little bit about how that focus, the rest of Africa, have increased within IDC in this space.
Thanks. So what the IDC has is a focus on green value chains. So I mentioned earlier Namibia, and what we've done is looked at where the critical green industry opportunities exist within the region. SADC is obviously our core focus because SADC is far closer to us. And we're wanting to ensure that we have a very systematic approach to our Africa investment going forward. I think historically over the last 20 years, we've been a lot more haphazard in where we have invested. So we're now wanting to ensure that along the value chains that are priorities to South Africa and the region, that we invest heavily and partner effectively. So very focused on the green energy, green hydrogen and battery minerals as the core focus, and agriculture. Because we do think that water, energy and agriculture are critical enablers to the just transition. Talks to the climate impact of the region as well as the climate opportunity from the region. So those would be our core focus areas in unlocking the potential of SADC and the broader region. The other is looking at partner hubs. So if you think about the automotive industry, Kenya, Morocco and Ghana are being seen as quite interesting nodes for automotive development. So how do we work collectively to ensure that we increase the African footprint in automotive manufacturing? I do believe you mentioned earlier about the very low footprint that Africa has. So I do think that this is Africa's opportunity for industrialization. And as the Industrial Development Corporation, we believe we have a very strong role to play in supporting Africa in becoming a green industrial hub. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joanne. And I'd like to now ask each one of you to just apply your minds to this question, which might not be an easy one, but you've been here now for a good number of days. What is the one insight, Vikram, from your sessions you've moderated and others you've attended? When you leave here, is there one thing when you arrive back in DC, when your family or everyone asks, about COP27, well, what's that one strategic insight that is new for you?
I think not just because that's the topic of this panel, but also because I think it is critical. Empathy. I think empathy as a bridge between climate finance and climate justice or equity is critical. And this is across the financial sector. This is from donors to recipient countries. I'll give you just a couple of quick examples. donors, and in the South African context, we've heard this. He mentioned the geographic and temporal issues, right? On a net basis, we are going to be ahead. But it's going to take a while to get there, and a lot of fiscal disruption. And donors are saying, oh, not every coal plant worker can become a solar fitter, right? I mean, it has to, so the donors are actually at some point asked whether jobs that don't go to renewables could be counted as climate finance. I mean, that is an absolute lack of empathy with what really needs to happen on the ground, right? Similarly for energy access, we are very happy that 90%, Africa having solar lanterns, 90% of Africa having solar lanterns is not enough energy access, right? We need to get to solar home systems, we need to get to mini grids, we need to get to productive power for 90% of Africa. So to me, that, and I would end by saying the MDBs have a big role to play, but empathy as a bridge between the two.
Thank you very much. Now, I've dominated the questions here to the panelists, and I'm aware that there are many experts and people in the room. Let me, before I ask them to, on that single question I've asked them about the biggest insight from this COP27, can I ask, just in the audience, I'm sure you have burning questions. I'll try to maybe coalesce them if there's quite a few, but let me just open up to you and see if you have any questions at this stage, and there's a roving mic there. Yeah. Just introduce yourself and the organization you're with.
Oh, yes. My name is Alexander Kermish, and I'm from BRICS Youth Energy Agency. And I'm really happy to be here, and thank you very much for this discussion. So I would like to get back a little bit to the just part of the transition, because we've mostly discussing some climate-related issues in energy. We've just introduced the Youth Energy Outlook a few days ago with so many South Africans participating in the research. And we've identified that there are so many youth businessmen from South Africa who are ready to introduce their technologies, something new to enable just energy transition in the country. So I was wondering, since there are so many international banking institutions here present, what's your ambition for working with the youth, young entrepreneurs, if you're working with those? Taking also that this discussion is being organized by the New Development Bank, so South African presidency next year in BRICS countries is coming. Are there any true mechanisms that would work to, let's say, include young entrepreneurs into the just energy transition next year, and how African Development Bank, the New Development Bank, Industrial Development Corporation would support it? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I'll ask the South Africans on the panel to think through an answer to that. But let's see if there are other questions as well before we return back to the panelists. Sure.
Good morning. Grateful for an insightful discussion. My name is Tembisile Salman from the New Development Bank, based in South Africa. I think Crispin touched on the danger of our exports that they face because of their high carbon intensity. And I think as a follow-up, Vikram talked around creation of carbon markets within South Africa. And I think it's a reality some of the companies are already facing in South Africa. I think I spoke to a delegation from South 32, and they mentioned that, in fact, their aluminum is already facing challenges in the European market because they're faced with aluminum that currently is produced from hydro. So I just want to get an idea from you, Vikram, perhaps. What can South Africa do to try and create that market? And would you see it as an easy thing to do? I mean, I think South Africa, we currently have a sole off-taker as in ESCOM. I mean, does that make it easier or more difficult to create that kind of market? Because I think it's particularly important if the other benefits in creation of such a market, I think it would also encourage the deployment of renewables within the economy itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Catherine, I wonder if you could maybe kick off. There was a first question around the just component and whether there's an explicit recognition of the role of entrepreneurs. How do you look at in your localization strategy? Is this a key component of the just transition agenda in the way that IDC views it?
Yes, so I think that we're becoming very cognizant that the youth can't be ignored. That's clear. What we do have at the DBSA currently is through the Green Fund that look at different technologies, and an area within project preparation called Product Innovation Unit. When the youth have a particular story to tell, that's probably an area where you should come to and have that discussion where we can assist them with funding to develop that particular idea. But also there's an area called D-Labs that's been developed by the DBSA, very localized socioeconomic development hubs. And what they're also interested in is technologies that can be showcased at those hubs and provided with support from the organization. So it's not as structured as we would like it to be, but it is available, or let me say it's not as pronounced. We don't announce it as we should, but it is available to engage them in innovation. And I think the mistake that we make a lot is we think that DFIs aren't innovative. That is something that's just that private sector does. But a lot of the innovation that happens, we create a market for the private sector to start investing. So we'd love to connect with whoever you've connected with at the conference in respect of the youth and see if we can assist you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. You want like to add, Joanne, from IDC?
Yeah. So at the IDC, we do have a specific youth focus within our business model, because we do believe that we need to unlock the potential of the youth and the innovation that comes with it. What we found is two things. The one is in working with partners in unlocking the potential of youth, because small businesses don't fail and entrepreneurs don't fail because of lack of access to finance. They fail because of lack of access to market. So our approach is very much to work with corporates to ensure that we can create the opportunities within their value chains for youth to participate. Where it comes to innovation, the innovation happens on two very distinct levels. There's the innovation that requires venture capital, and that is not the space that DFIs, through their governance structures, are best placed to actually support. So we do need to see how we can work with public or with private sector venture capital firms to ensure that the youth opportunities are supported. And then there's the innovation. We've got some young people who brought us ideas for technology innovation, and we would be able to partner with them in project development through the scoping pre-feasibility stage. But what we need to understand, or what the youth need to understand, is that it is sometimes more valuable to have 50% of a viable project than 100% of nothing. So it is understanding that technical partners are sometimes needed in order to exploit the technology, particularly if we're going to do it at speed. So we need to manage the expectations of the youth to ensure that their ideas are properly incubated and commercialized, and that needs partnerships. Thanks.
Vikram, there was a specific question posed to you, if you could just address that quickly.
Can I just confirm, just to clarify, the Product Innovation Unit does offer VC-type assistance for those 4 ideas. So it's not specifically youth, but it does provide that type of access. And they are currently busy in a number of initiatives, like I think one of 4 carbon capturers in the market in the world. So they're busy with quite a bit of innovation that I think you should just meet with us and see what we can do for you.
Daniel, you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I would just like to add that, well, let me take that in the hand, it's a bit easier, that on the youth question, this is a critical area also from our side. We're working at the moment on what we call youth entrepreneurship banks, basically seeing how we can capacitate through financial means and otherwise commercial banks to be able to support sort of youth-led businesses to provide sort of that also early stage more risky support. I think that's sort of one piece of innovation that is in the works. It's not yet fully operational, but it's one of the priorities also of the president of the African Development Bank to help address that challenge and that opportunity at the same time that the youth presents.
Vikram?
Yeah, quick. Nothing's easy, but we are all here, right? So we can get this done. In short, I think it'll require work, but if a globally accepted methodology is going to be developed that allows for carbon credits from accelerated retirement of coal to enter the global voluntary markets, corporates in the US, if they can do that, South Africa can do it internally. If the corporates in South Africa end up in a internal domestic system where these credits are transferred to them using the same globally accepted methodology, it has two benefits. One, the actual emission reductions remain within South Africa and be counted towards South Africa's NDC. And two, because the corporates have paid that higher price for carbon based on a globally accepted methodology, arguably the implicit intensity has now reduced. This goes back to my earlier point of cross-border issues can potentially be documented and addressed as having been taken care of and not subject to additional tariff.
We're rapidly moving towards closure soon, so I'd like maybe just to ask Chippy very quickly, give us the sort of one insight when you land back in Johannesburg from COP27 for the first week now. What do you think is that one idea that you're going to take forward?
So the thrilling part of this conference for me has been meeting colleagues in different developing countries. And I was particularly struck by my conversations with Indonesia, Vietnam, Senegal, and Nigeria, where each of them is thinking through exactly the same issues we've been talking about this morning. So I'm leaving this conference with a real sense of momentum amongst a cohort of developing countries that are spotting the same opportunities and who are very actively trying to integrate climate and development and economic growth issues as they move forward.
Thank you very much, Chippy. Daniel, anything that stands out for you from the meetings you have had so far? A short intervention on insights to date?
Let me just add one.
Just one quick addition to what was just said, because I think that's so important. There are indeed similar types of processes, obviously each different on the country specifics, going on in many countries around the world. And that's sort of why sort of collaborative mechanisms such as the Energy Transition Council work that was kicked off prior to COP26 can play a key role, that there are cross-learnings, that is experience sharing, sort of kind of trying to learn from what works best. In terms of takeaways, just two things from my side. One is, it is an Africa COP, so I think there's a lot more focus and attention to particular issues and challenges Africa faces. And not only in terms of challenges, but also in terms of the opportunities that Africa present. We talked about green hydrogen. I think there's been a lot of conversations around that topic, and Africa can be and should be a key part of the solution. And yet, so I hope that from COP there's a real kind of drive towards implementation, seizing that potential and mobilizing the financing that is required to address it.
Catherine, any brief comments from your side? Any final burning insight you want to give us for the last couple of days? What have you gained?
Nothing clever, just that private sector, I see a lot more private sector this time round, which is great, but also that we are in a bubble, you know, of like-minded people, and you just have to phone home and realize the challenges, sometimes the disconnect between what we're driving and what's happening at home. And so I think we've got our work cut out for us, and that's why I'm saying the journey for everybody is not the same, and sometimes it's not as elegant as we'd like it to be.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'd like to thank the panelists for their excellent contributions. It certainly enriched my understanding of the nuances in the just transition process. Our Chief Risk Officer, Mr. Anil Kishora, will, after a short 2-minute video where we will just showcase one or two of the projects that New Development Bank have pioneered in the renewable space, will make some concluding remarks after the video. So what I'd like now to do is just to firstly thank the panelists by all us applauding their contribution. And then I would like to ask you all to have a seat. We'll play a short 2.5-minute video, and then we will do the concluding remarks on behalf of NDB from Anil. Can we put the video on?
South Africa is the most advanced economy in sub-Saharan Africa, yet it is still facing frequent electricity shortages. NDB has provided a loan of $180 million to Eskom, a state-owned power company, to develop its power grid infrastructure. The project will help to develop the transmission lines to connect to the renewable energy plants. It will not only increase the electricity supply to South Africa, but also help to decarbonize its power sector.
The project is a collaboration between the governments of South Africa and Lesotho and is the biggest bi-national infrastructure project between the two countries today.
Good morning, and let me start by thanking our great panelists and the audience for all the incisive questions. We all learned a lot about just transition in South Africa. As I got to know today, this issue of just transition, especially in South Africa, is kind of very complex given its high energy intensity, the carbon intensity of the GDP, and the high employment in the coal value chain. So if we succeed in South Africa, probably we succeed elsewhere as well. And I'm very happy to note that the government of South Africa has come up with a roadmap, a plan, which is very clear to come up with a net job positive transition, which is really important to have a net positive job transition. And as we all know, at the current pace of carbon emissions, in case all the countries live up to their commitments under their latest NDCs, even then we are headed for a 1.9 degree warmer planet by the end of the century, which means we'll have to scale up, we'll have to accelerate transition. If we do that, it's really important that we take care of this issue of making it just. We have to put in place those guardrails so that it remains just as we scale up, accelerate transition. And I'm sure South Africa has got those modalities. In regard to financing, whatever we do in terms of all the MDBs together, DFIs, there is this leverage constraint. So given the capital you have, only a certain multiple can be done. So it's really important that we mobilize private capital. And as Vikram mentioned about originate to distribute and the partnerships that Catherine and Joanne also spoke about, that's the way to move forward. So it will be kind of a whole of community approach where you are passing on the ownership of these energy assets to the people, to the poor people who have higher stakes in that, and you maintain this balance between energy demand and the requirements of just transition. So it's going to be a complex task, but listening to the experts today, I think we are convinced that we are on the right path and the goals of just transition will be achieved in a way which is net positive in terms of jobs, in terms of energy, in terms of private capital mobilization and all of that. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks. And a great thanks to our panelists as well for asking all those awesome questions and moderating it. Thank you.
Maybe just to also thank the online audience for their participation, and that then brings to a close our session this morning. Thanks again.